This week on the Eldritch Lorecast.
I don't know if I like what this playtest is doing to me because I was yelling at the TV screen like I was watching a sport.
I want to hear what you have to say, Shawn, but I want to hear it after I finish my point.
Like it. You must like it. Everybody likes Feats.
Unless you've tried to read the ORC.
Or the Silmarillion.
Yeah. Or the Silmarillion.
Shawn, are the Aussies making fun of me? I can't tell anymore.
I'm lost. How do you generate names for creative projects? And my answer is poorly.
I don't know if I like it.
I will take a good thinking person who writes role-playing games to write a poem over the Lucius Goosiest hippie who thinks they have a connection to the ethereal plane.
All that and more right now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 tabletop RPG and fantasy TV review podcast in all the realms. That's right. They had to write an extra season of The Rings of Power just so we could review it 6 months later as well. Can't wait for that. Stick around for it. My name's Ben Byrne, and I'm here joined by Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin,
Did you just say my name's
Hake.
Ben Byrne?
Yeah, I say
In
that
the
every
intro?
week. Yeah, I don't know why. Look, I had a rough week last week,
I mean, it's not
sleep-wise. My cat.
technically false or anything. But
It's been up to this point. It will continue to be so unless I decide on a name change. Anyway, James Hake.
Hi.
Josh has a question for the podcast, which is, we talked about extraplanar realms, extraplanar travel last week when we were talking about the ethereal expanse. What is your favorite extraplanar realm to adventure in or to feature adventures in?
Well, when I first started playing D&D, there was something... The first plane we ever went to was Acheron, the realm of the goblin gods, and a plane that is essentially a bunch of metal cubes floating in planar ether. And I've never actually seen anything official published for the plane of Acheron, but boy, did it become a meme in my D&D group all through high school. We'd be like, all right, what are we going to do this week, boys? And we're going to be the battle cubes. We're going to go back to the battle cubes, because this is such a bad answer for you, Ben, because it's actually like my least favorite of the planes, because it's so one note. It's just the battle cubes. But that in its way has kind of made it my favorite, because you want to go fight things endlessly for the glory of the goblin gods. Well, you got to go to the battle cubes, you know.
Yeah, everybody knows that.
Gotta go to the
Everybody
battle
goes to the battle cubes. Come on, man.
memes are important to the enjoyment of the outer planes.
Yes.
Dael Kingsmill, speaking of outer planes, do you have a favorite?
Look, I'm being real with you right now. I don't know the outer planes, so I'm looking at a list right now, and I'm picking based on the names. And I gotta say, Pandemonium sounds like a real fun time.
Shawn Merwin, do you have a favorite planar realm?
The complete opposite of Pandemonium is Mechanus, or Mechanus, depending on how you choose to pronounce it. And that is where the Modrons live. And that is where they keep everything moving in clockwork rhythm. And it's so fun to set adventures there. I have come to dislike alignment in general, and the matching of alignments with planes and the whole philosophy behind it, because more fights broke out over alignment and what it means and what it does to characters than who's going to buy the pizza at games over the years. But I love this idea that there is this perfectly clockwork place, and then you insert the smallest grain of sand into those gears and you watch everything fall apart. And the characters think they're doing something fun or cool, and then the Modrons get upset at them. And these cute little squares and triangles and rectangles and cubes and cylinders suddenly become a little less cute when that happens.
Well, speaking of cute things, my very cute self and Shawn Merwin are going to Gen Con this year. That's right. Time for the news. Breaking news. Ghostfire Gaming announced over the weekend via their Twitter. Now we're announcing it on the Twitch. That we are going to Gen Con. We're going to be there with a booth. I'm going to be there. Shawn's going to be there. Dante's going to be there. If you want to know if you want to meet Dante in person, I believe Joe Rasso at this point is one of our producers. I'm sorry, Joe. I always get there's producer and there's another P starting role that I always get confused. I'm sorry, everybody. Don't get mad at me.
He is a
Joe
producer,
Rasso's coming down as well.
Last week, I called him the master of production.
Joe Rasso, the master of production, is also coming down, I believe. So come hang out at the Ghostfire booth. We're going to be in the Entrepreneur Avenue, I think it's called, or the Entrepreneur Alley. It's where of first time Gen Con kind of showcase people go. So that's where the Ghostfire booth's going to be. Come hang out. I believe we're also running some games with World of Game Design are going to be running some Fables for us. So if you've never got the chance to play any of the Fables adventures, they're going to be running Citadel of the Unseen Sun and Agents of the Empire and Pirates of the Ethereal Expanse, the early adventures from there. So there's a lot happening. I'm also going to be at the Dungeon Dudes are running an epic adventure with Ginny D, with D&D Shorts, and with Pointy Hat, and I'm going to be one of the GMs running that.
Hell
you can't get tickets because it's already sold out, which I have a question about in a moment. But yeah, I don't know if you can tell. I'm super excited. I'm super excited to go. I hope to see everybody there. I'm really looking forward to meeting a lot of people in person I haven't got to meet yet, both Ghostfire and abroad. So put me on a plane. Anyway, I did have a question. Because all of the events, as far as I'm aware, that are happening at Gen Con only went live for you to be able to book a spot like last week, and almost all of them are sold out already. Is that normal?
Yes.
Woo!
Okay.
Now that's a con.
Yes. They open registration for events on Sunday, generally Sunday at noon Eastern time in the US.
Yeah.
And within an hour, everything's sold out. Except you may find a random ticket here and there, and people will return tickets. But for the most part, yes, that is all of the games that World of Game Design are running for us are sold out, except two still have ticket openings. So and sometimes more will be added later. So keep checking back. But it is a hard time getting a ticket for anything.
Yeah, the hot tip I heard was I haven't used it, so I don't know this expertly, but the Gen Con website has like a wish list on the events that you can add events to your wish list. So even if they're sold out, if they become available, you can keep checking back your wish list just to see if anything has opened up. So do that. Shawn, are you looking forward to going?
I definitely am. I haven't been since probably 2017.
Okay.
It is a massive convention. Lots of things to do. The dealer hall is interesting to maneuver through. Being small and agile helps. Or being very large and impervious to bludgeoning also helps. And other than that, you meet all the people. You get to have some fun games. Lots of things happen off the books, so you can find games, meet with people, get together. It is going to be, and getting to meet all the Ghostfire folks in person for the first time. All the Australian folks, I should say. I am very much looking forward to that. Bringing my family along as protection, bodyguards. So that's important.
Yeah, fair enough. Why didn't I think of that? Damn. I'm going to be in trouble now. Dael, James, have either of you, I know you, as far as I'm aware, neither of you are going this year, currently, plans. But have you been in the past? What's it like? Give me all the goss. As a first-time attendee, I need all the details.
I went probably for the last time back in 2017 or 2018 also. Yeah, my first ever Gen Con
back in the before times.
I know, the before times. There's the times when I could go to a convention that had over 100,000 people at it and not fear for my life a little bit. Yeah. No, it was nice. I went down when my pal Dan Dillon still lived in Indianapolis before he moved up to Wizards of the Coast here in Seattle. And that basically made me feel like I was able to go because the hotel lottery for Gen Con is so intense. And to be honest, that's the thing that kind of keeps me from going most times, is not wanting to deal with finding a place to stay.
You feeling
But
good, Ben? You feeling hyped? You feeling...
I don't have to worry about any of that because I'm going with the company. I'm just
Yeah.
like, what's going on? Yeah, we got a hotel. All right, sweet.
Great.
I don't need to worry about it. The biggest
That's
stress I
the
have
way
is
to do
getting
it.
my passport, but
But Indianapolis is a great city. It's pretty walkable. There's a lot of good food around. The sort of after con parties are really fun to go to. They open up the whole sports stadium for like a big sort of board game free play, which is one of my favorite parts of the show. Just walking into like a football stadium and seeing a million board game nerds playing board games on the turf, that was pretty great. I don't know what to say. The thing about Gen Con that struck me as surprising is that it's not really a panel con. There are not a lot of live panels there, which is kind of my favorite part of cons. I love going to see the experts talk about their experiences and what they do when faced with problems that I've faced, or what they do when faced with problems I will never face. And it's fun. I like the story time. So there's not a lot of that at Gen Con. There's a lot of game playing at Gen Con, which is also good.
cool.
Yeah, I think I am slowly coming to terms with the fact that my lived experience of conventions and the reality of conventions are two very different things. Because you see, I'm from south of Sydney, and the biggest conventions we get are not draws the way that something like Comic-Con or PAX or Gen Con is. So that plus I don't have to worry about hotels. I can just get on a train and I'll be there in an hour. You know what I mean? And so that was my experience of conventions for a really long time. And now that I, exist in this realm of occasionally appearing at conventions to talk, I don't think I quite comprehend the level of like organization actually needed for that. Because usually I figure out that I'm going to a convention a matter of weeks before the convention, and I don't realize things like the hotel lottery. And so then it's, a couple weeks out from San Diego Comic-Con, I'm slated to be on a panel, and I have to call up. The last time, I called my cousin who lived in San Diego for a long time. And so she hooked me up with some friends that I could stay with at the last minute. And I was texting with one of them. His name was Chad. He was the most San Diego guy you could imagine. He was a surfer guy. He was like, hey, dude, my name is Chad. Like, that's how he talked. And he also was a hacker. He had long speeches about how he missed the days of, these actual real hacker conventions, and now they're all fakes. But that was the thing. But I was meant to go and stay at his place. And then at some point he sort of changed the meeting point at the last minute to this bar. And my friend Omar was dropping me off, and he was like, I don't know about this. Should I stay with you? And I'm like, I think I'm fine. I think everything's, I can call you if anything goes wrong. And so I meet Chad at this bar. He's like, yeah, hey, what kind of like level of degree do you have? Because, everyone needs a master's these days. Like, it was the weirdest conversation. And then he takes me, he's like, actually, you're not going to stay at my place. Here's what I've got for you. And he apparently had this like rich aunt who lived at this like $5 million beach house in San Diego, and she was away for the weekend. And so I was staying at her place. And then I was there the whole time. But he said, she might show up at some point, but, she spends most of the weekend staying at the home of her young lover. And I was like, what is going on? And so I'm staying in this extremely rich place, and I didn't know what to do. I was getting in contact with my nana. I was like, you're like a fancy person. Like, how am I meant to act in this home? And then I just got myself really freaked out that she was going to come home at some point and I wouldn't know that she was home. So I just tried to spend all of my time out of the house. And then on the last day, I did come downstairs and there was a glass on the kitchen bench with lipstick stain on it. And then I tried to give the key back to Chad, but he never got back to me. He said, just throw it in the trash. Just throw the key in the trash. What? What do you mean? I kept it. It's hanging up in a frame in my room. Anyway.
So here's a disclaimer.
We digress.
Here's a disclaimer. Not all convention lodging is like that.
Yeah.
The cardboard boxes that you're staying in might not be as nice. You gotta wait
till the last minute. You've got a hotel lottery or...
Anyway, speaking of rich aunts, there's not a whole lot of other news this week. There's kind of the usual. D&D Beyond put out a video talking about the playtest survey. A lot of stuff we've talked about before. Did anybody pull anything out of there that they thought was super exciting that they wanted to talk about?
Exciting isn't the word I would. Yeah, I was saying last night in the Lorecast chat. I don't know if I like what this playtest is doing to me because I was yelling at the TV screen like I was watching a sport. But I wasn't fully heckling. I was just saying things like, "Then commit to that, Jeremy. Commit." The only thing that does stand out to me is that I think it's so interesting, as someone who hates the epic boons so much and what they've done to class and subclass builds, I do think it's interesting that specifically he said no one really uses the epic boons, but we think that's because they're in the DMG and no one knows that they're there, so we're going to make them a key part of the game. And then also at another time, less than half of groups use feats, which I was surprised by because everyone talks about that as though feats are universal, but I've been saying in videos for ages, feats are optional and not everyone uses them. You can't assume everyone uses them, but here we go. Less than half of groups use feats apparently. And so again, it strikes me as odd that the answer to that is, we'll make them core. People just don't know what they're missing out on.
Yeah, I was surprised by that as well, because any time I've done any sort of, poll, whether it's on Twitter or YouTube, asking about feats, the feedback I tend to get is that like 90% of groups use feats. Almost nobody doesn't use feats. But obviously there's a fair bit of confirmation bias kind of going in there in terms of like, we have the audience that is most engaged with D&D and the rule set.
And also I do wonder whether there's a slight definition difference between groups that allow feats versus people who are using feats. Sure. Even if your table, your group, your DM allows feats, do you as a player actually use them? Because I looked back and there's a lot of characters I've built that haven't used feats.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, how are they collating that data? Is it through, I mean, it might not be, but is it through D&D Beyond? And is it through just like looking at how many campaigns are set up in D&D Beyond and how many characters within those campaigns have one or more feats? Do they count a campaign where somebody's taken the variant human and taken a feat as part of that? Because that feels like unreliable data for the number of people that just set up a campaign for one character to be able to access.
I like that we're questioning the reliability of the data that Wizards of the Coast has because we as individuals are like, wait a minute, but we play with feats all the time. My 5 groups.
That's fair. I just, it's not so much that I'm questioning it. I'm just curious where that data is coming from.
It's definitely coming from D&D Beyond. I mean, I don't say that with literal 100% surety, but the amount of data that D&D Beyond gives them strikes me as like reason number one why Wizards actually bought D&D Beyond in the first place. And so that absolutely, I mean, it has to be where that data is coming from. And I think you're right to question. I want to hear what you have to say, Shawn, but I think you're right to question that. I want to hear it after I finish my point. I don't have much to say. I just want to get done with it. I just think you're right to question it, Ben, because there's a lot of confounding factors that we have no idea if Wizards has screened for, right? Like I think there are people out there who will just set up campaigns because they own a bunch of the books and their friends don't. They want to share the books with their friends. Creating a campaign, making it public to all 9 people they know who play D&D is a really, really easy way to do that.
What's odd, though, is whether or not 100% or 0% or somewhere in between use it, the logic of people don't use it, so therefore we're going to force them to use it seems to bugger the imagination.
I can see Dael's mind melting in real time.
And that was the only thing where I just did a,
Yeah, because it really is. Also, I mean, the idea of the epic boons, they're in the DMG, so people just don't know that they're there. So that's why they don't use them, is an interesting assumption to me. Because at the very least, if people aren't using them, maybe they don't know they're there. But then you can't assume that once they do know they're there, that they will like them. It's just an unusual choice from my perspective.
You like it. You must like it. Everybody likes feats. A weird sentence. Anyway, moving on. There was a new...
This sentence directed by Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah, exactly. A new, I think, intended to be largely finalized version of the ORC, the Open something resource for companies that make games. I think that's what it stands for.
Yeah.
I didn't
There's
look
no
at this
R in
because
there, but that's close.
I said resource.
Oh, okay.
Did anybody look at it? Did anybody find anything amazingly interesting that the public would be curious about in there?
I glanced at it. It's mostly they've rearranged things into a more sensible structure. They've included the phrase "such as" at the beginning of their lists, which I'm very happy with. They seem to have added a little bit more protection for, like, sensible protection for people who publish under.
Unlike Dael, I never look at legal documents for fun. So when Dael said there's nothing, I trusted her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, me too. Speaking of the ORC, Cobalt Press have their Kickstarter launching tomorrow, 23rd US time for Tales of the Valiant. That seemed to come out of nowhere. I expected a little bit more fanfare, a little bit more build up from them. Maybe it's, I don't know. I was going to say, maybe it's because I'm not following their blogs, but I feel like I have read every single one for this podcast to, pardon me, kind of follow that news along. So I feel like that just was kind of like, oh, we got to get this out there. Let's do it. So go check that out. And that's the news for this week. On to emails. If you'd like to send an email podcast at ghostfiregaming.com for questions that I will convey, I think is the word I'm looking for, to this panel of experts here. I think we've hit the emails in record time, but that's good because we have a lot of emails to go through. One in particular that arrived from Cassandra sent us a long email. Thank you for sending that through, Cassandra. I've pulled 3 kind of separate questions out of it that are sort of related, so we can morph them into one depending on where you want to go. But Cassandra's first question that was inside of their email was about writing style. Do you have a specific writing style? Do the goals or requirements of a given project influence the writing style? I believe the example they included was like, if you're writing for 5e, do you need to use a more generalized language than what you might naturally tend towards? Because 5e is a very generalized kind of, it's for a lot of people. Is it emotionally difficult to conform to a style that's suitable for the project that might be different from your own? Does the expectations of the audience influence your style? What is your typical writing style? Any and all of those questions, feel free to pick up from go.
I love this question, and I can talk for an hour about it. So I'm going to restrain myself for a moment if Shawn and Dael want to say anything, because otherwise I will run the entire way with it.
I want to hear what you have to say, James, and I will interrupt you only 7 or 8 times during your answer.
I'm begging you, Shawn, please interrupt me. I'll be insufferable otherwise. The style of writing in D&D is tremendously important, and it's the one thing that I am most concerned with. Not like I'm worried, but like it's the thing that my job concerns the most as a lead developer / managing editor, whether it's for Ghostfire or for a project with Wizards or with Darrington Press. Whenever I do this, this is the most important thing that I care about. Other than, of course, the more nebulous, is it good? Because typically style is what determines if it's good D&D writing. D&D has a very precarious balance within it that most players don't think about because they don't need to. And I'm not talking about game balance. I'm talking about the balance between prose writing and technical writing. If you've ever read a computer manual or a car manual or anything like that, you've seen a lot of technical writing, and it's usually very dense. It's usually full of jargon, and it's usually the single most impenetrable thing you have ever tried to put into your brain.
Unless you've tried to read the ORC.
Or the Silmarillion.
Yeah. Or the Silmarillion.
Well, I'll get back to the Silmarillion. Because, on the other hand, there's also prose writing. And prose writing should be evocative, and it should inspire your imagination, and it should make you want to be in the world of fantasy and danger that we're trying to convey within D&D stuff. And ultimately, it's the writer's job to provide the fantasy of prose without ever compromising the clarity and precision of technical writing. And either way, if you lean too far in either direction, you'll get a sour result. If you lean too far into the prose, you'll have sloppy mechanics that don't do what you want them to do if you take a close reading of them. Because as people from Wizards have said many times, D&D is coded in the English language. Your English must be very precise when you want to do stuff. If you want to emulate that classic 5e Wizards of the Coast style. And if you lean too far in the technical direction, all your prose ends up sounding like the Silmarillion, where it can be evocative in places, but it is so dry. It's like chewing through a mouth of Biscoff cookies without any water. And so,
yeah, we know what that's like.
Totally, all the time. Biscoff cookies, puh.
Constantly, yeah.
No, thank you, Grandma. Am I right?
Yeah. Put them back in the packet. That's what we always say in my household.
Come on, close the tin, Granny. Put them back on the top shelf. Not without a cup of milk, please.
Shawn, are the Aussies making fun of me? I can't tell anymore.
I don't even know what a Biscoff cookie is, so I'm lost.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Only the timeliest references from me, someone who eats cookies on airplanes. All that to say, if you're a writer who wants to write for D&D, you'll have a bias one way or the other, because everyone has a bias one way or the other. And it's my job as a managing editor to make sure that that balance is struck throughout the entire book, throughout all the turnovers, etc., etc., etc. And with that in mind, I'm looking back at the question to make sure I haven't rambled onto an immense tangent. D&D often comes with sprawling style guides. Depending on the publisher, there's a way that the book is meant to be written in. With D&D, they use the Chicago Manual of Style. But, there are many other styles. If you write for a newspaper, you might use AP style. If you're a student, you might use MLA style. And that's more than just citing your sources. It's a way of writing. And this is all like, it's so in the weeds that the average player would never care about this, because it deals with nuance that you would notice if it were gone, but you would never notice because it's there. Because the ultimate goal of all of this stylistic writing is consistency and recognizability. If D&D changed the way they presented their information in every book they published because there is no stylistic oversight, you would find it nearly impossible to play D&D. And there's a huge kind of under the surface level debate that goes on often in third-party publishing, in the third-party publishing space, of what should our style guide be? Should we try and ape what Wizards of the Coast does? There's a lot of good reasons to do that, right? I tend to do that for projects with Ghostfire because it's familiar, it's friendly, it's fairly middle of the road. It's not too over the top in any one way, and so it makes it highly accessible to a wide audience. And usually, when you are not Wizards of the Coast, you're not the big man on campus, and you're trying to fight for every pair of eyes you can get on what you're writing, making something that's broadly open and accessible is pretty good.
No, it's proven. It's proven. We know that people can use it because people use it. And so it's safe. But on the other hand, if you're a niche publisher already, why not get funky with it? Why not go hyper niche and do things totally different from the way that Wizards does? If you're using 5e, right, there's already an instinct to do what Wizards does, because why are you using 5e? Well, it's not because it tells your story particularly well, unless weirdly it does. Usually you do it because it's the thing that's popular, and everyone knows 5e, and people are likely to buy 5e. So if you've gone to all that trouble already of not building a new RPG system that works perfectly for the game you want to run or the story you want to tell, you want to use something that's familiar to the 5e audience. But there are exceptions. If you're really deep into the old school community, the O5R, right? The old school 5e Renaissance community. This is a subset of a niche community.
Yeah, I feel like we're on the iceberg now.
Yeah. But, there are old school gamers who love 5th edition because it has some old school tendencies and it's because it's popular. And so it strikes that balance of it fulfills their sort of niche delight, and it also has some broad appeal. So yeah, let's bring everyone into the tent. Those games with an old school bent to them tend to be really bizarre and really weird. And they will often want to be highly personalized and stylized and a little bit auteur in their way of going. And if you are an auteur, to create sort of a metaphor here, you're not going to be working with Marvel. You're not going to be doing Marvel movies. And that's what D&D is at the end of the day. It's the Marvel movie studio of RPGs. They're a big studio. They have a really specific style. Everything kind of, they put a lot of genres into that specific broad style. And so it's like comparing, what is it? It's like comparing Doctor Strange 2, a Sam Raimi film, with The Evil Dead. The Evil Dead is weird and wild and bloody and it breaks all the rules. And like Doctor Strange 2 kind of does that, but it's definitely still a Marvel film. So to create a thesis statement out of all of this nonsense, if you are an RPG publisher, if you're an indie RPG publisher, whether you're one person or 5 people or 10 people or whatever, think of this sort of thing when you're deciding how you want your manuscript to be written, because it might be the most important thing you've never thought about.
My style of writing, it's funny because I think of the way that I write my stuff as being broadly in the scope of how 5e does it. And I always realize the minute I'm publishing something just for public consumption, or, you know, if I'm going the extra step, publishing it on the DMs Guild, suddenly I realize how much work there is to be done to actually make it conform. Because when I'm writing something for my own use at the table, I'm, you know, formatting it in a way that I find really easy to read. For the really obvious example that's come up before, my monster stat blocks are formatted completely differently from how they are in published material because I find it easier to read that way. But the minute that I'm publishing, you know, my version of Beholder online, I suddenly have to rearrange everything because that's not how everyone else is used to seeing it. And then not to mention, the minute I'm going to publish something on the DMs Guild, I need an editor. I need an editor who is familiar with this style to come in and rejig everything, because inevitably there's stuff that I've missed that I'm perfectly capable of coming up with on the fly at my table. It doesn't matter if I've missed it. But once it's there for someone else's consumption or for, you know, sale, it becomes a really big kind of element of it. And that's not to say that you have to conform to it, like we've already discussed, but I am interested in stuff like, you read MCDM books, even the ones that are designed to work with 5th edition, and there is this real flair of personal style in them, not just in these big prose sections that pop in and out in a way that they don't in official 5e material, but also throughout the actual mechanical text. It'll be like, and here's how you do this, or don't do whatever you want, smiley face emoticon. You know what I mean? Like it's so specific to, especially the early ones, Matt's voice. And I'm curious as well to where that line comes in terms of Arcadia, because I've never written for Arcadia, which is the MCDM sort of magazine. But I suspect that they probably have a lot more room in Arcadia for personal voice coming through. And it is an exciting place to see personal expression. But I wonder how many people leap at that opportunity when you're working in a space where you are expected to be able to meet that sort of writing style.
There's an old saying, form follows function. And so what's the function of what you're writing? The function of what you're writing is a tool to let other people use your work as a springboard for their creativity, their storytelling, and their game. Then you better make sure your style, whether it's in terms of the form or the writing or the art or the font or all of those things that make up style, you better make sure it delivers on that function. When I was working on the first drafts of the Acquisitions Incorporated hardcover adventure, we did not expect to be published by Wizards of the Coast. So therefore, we went way off the rails. And it was glorious. And it was
Which
wonderful.
makes sense as well for Rack Inc. You know what I mean? Like, yep. Totally.
Yeah. And we were able to create some very hilarious, very bizarre, very questionable things that would have been great. When it went and became a Wizards of the Coast published product, it didn't change as much as I thought it would, but it definitely had to change a bit because now the function was going to be different. So therefore the form had to be different. And we could still use the proper styling in terms of layout to deliver both a playable product as well as a humorous, satirical product. Both. So in that sense, style means many different things. And to to hammer down what exactly a change in style means could take you down a long and torturous road of what exactly are you talking about? Calligraphy? Are you talking about just the text writing? Are you talking about the art and the style that adds to something? It's an excellent question, but it's a very broad question that, as James said, could provoke a lot of pontificating on our part.
I think as someone who I've kind of come into writing D&D content the same way Dael has, right? Which is as a fan of the content that then begins to put their own work into the public eye, and so is on some level self-taught in how to write for game design and how to write for D&D specifically, 5e specifically. I think the small difference for me was that I actually don't mind the way that 5e is laid out in the way that it is. I quite like the way that monster stat blocks are laid out. Probably because, like, if they were laid out in a completely different way, I probably would have just got used to that style instead of the style that they're in. But because I've gotten used to reading them as they are, if I see a monster stat block that's not laid out anything like what Wizards have been laying them out, it takes me a second to find the bits of the stat block I need to find to be able to use it. So I'm a bit of a stickler for two reasons. Partly because I'm also a war gamer, and in war games, because it's a competitive game, because it's almost more of a sport than it is like a narrative game, you want those rules to be as tight as possible so that it's, in theory, a fair playing field for both sides of the game. And so keywording becomes really important. The specifics of what a phrase means becomes really important. And so I'm very big on specificity in matching the style of the SRD, at least when it comes to talking about rules specifically.
The important thing to remember, though, Ben, is what you're describing in war game rules is just as important in writing nonfiction, is just as important in writing fiction, is just as important in writing poetry. You are setting up all of these things. You want the language you use in poetry to be just as precise and just as linked and just as enmeshed with each other as it is in a war game or a role-playing game. You need that. And good writing is good writing anywhere, because good writing means that you've thought about it. Good writing means that you've analyzed your own work. And when you can do that, you can write anything. I will take a good thinking person who writes role-playing games to write a poem over, the Lucius Goosius hippie who thinks they have a connection to the ethereal plane, but they're not writing something that actually makes sense with the words on the page and the text all connecting.
Yeah. I agree with you, but I suppose what I mean especially when I talk about keywords, is if I'm writing a poem and I'm sort of addressing the same concept, I might use two different words that are synonyms of each other because they technically sound nicer when you read them, and they kind of flow together and they create two separate images that kind of morph to create one image. Whereas if I'm writing a rules document, I will use the exact same word multiple times if I have to, so that it doesn't accidentally convey a different meaning, or people don't think I'm not talking about the same concept.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry,
go ahead, Dael. No, you.
All I was going to say is that I was thinking a similar thing to Shawn, and I was thinking about it with the term clarity. But as Shawn spoke, I realized that that's not the word to use. The word is specificity, because the specificity of what you want to use with a different form of writing, a different, poem versus RPG versus whatever, that there is a different sort of specificity that you're looking for, but it is always that specificity. It's that, I'm choosing to use this word for this reason because it will have this impact.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes in poetry, the ambiguity is specific.
Exactly. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
In good poetry.
You touched on this a little bit before as well, and James and Dael kind of did as well when talking about Arcadia. But this was another one of Cassandra's questions, which was around flavor text versus rules text. And whether they can be intermingled, should be intermingled, are better to be entirely separated, as Cassandra seemed to indicate, prefers the way that Magic the Gathering, but I think a lot of card games do, where they'll tend to have the italics flavor text, so you can just ignore it. But the proper typed text is kind of the rules text that you need to pay attention to. Whereas 5e kind of does this, but in spells was Cassandra's specific example. They tend to describe what the spell looks like kind of, dramatically first before going into what the spell does in actuality. And that can be the same as well with like monster abilities and stuff like that. The dragon breathes a breath of fire, every character in a such and such cone, and then it kind of goes down into the technical text. Do you feel there needs to be this separation, or it is just a matter of style?
I think it's an important bridge to have, but in this hobby where it's a game and also a storytelling vehicle, to show people who may be favoring one or the other, or who have trouble combining the two, that this is what the spell is narratively, this is what the spell is mechanically, and the two, if done right and if done elegantly with both clarity and all the words that we've been saying, will flow. What is a problem is when the two are at odds, or when one is so vague or one is poorly written, so you go to the other to try to ferret out what it should be, and then you get conflicting signals and arguments.
I think it's such a specific thing, specificity. For 5e, I think that simultaneously you're working with the fact that they made the decision that this was going to be written in natural language rather than the sort of format that we see before in things like 4th edition D&D, where it is, I mean, you do have that kind of, it is kind of what Cassandra's talking about here, right? You've got your sort of italicized flavor text somewhere in there, but mostly it's like, these are the rules for how to make this work. And it felt mechanic, it felt gamey. Gamist, there we go, we're back to last week. But 5e decided to go in a different direction, kind of try to mingle all of those things. And, it has its pros and its cons the whole way through. I think one thing to keep in mind is that when writing these things for 5e, a lot of it is enabling quick decision-making during character creation or spell choice or things like that, right? So you are a player who's looking through the player's handbook for the first time, you're flipping through, you're reading the barbarian. The first thing that's going to catch your eye is the name of each of those features. So the name is super, super important, brutal critical, that tells me something. Ooh, isn't that interesting, And then you go and you read, and you're not going to read the whole you're not going to read through the entire class, you're going to read through skimming the first sentence of each thing. So it's going to tell you, hey, when you get a crit, you do even more damage. And they tell you that in a flavorful way that's meant to sell you on that concept. And so you can flip through really quickly and go, all right, I want to play a ranger or whatever, based on those really simple things. You flip through those spells and you go, oh, cool, this makes people explode. I love that. I want to do that. And you don't have to actually read or worry about the mechanics until you get into the actual play. And that's a really fast way of onboarding people into creating a character that they feel like they can connect with on some level, and giving them an idea of what the playstyle is going to look like without actually having to read through all the rules, which is very laborious. And then you get weird places where it does become a bit of an issue, which is spells like Chill Touch, where you read that title and you go, I get an idea of what that is. And then you read the first sentence and you go, that is not what I thought it would be. Which is, I think titles are pretty important. Anyway.
D&D is a game that wants to appeal to a lot of different kinds of gamers. And given its place in this hobby, I think it's right to do so. And not to make this discussion about 4th edition, but because we could talk about that for hours. But one of the reasons why people say 4th edition failed is because it alienated a large group of D&D fans. And those were the D&D fans who treated it as a storytelling vehicle. There, like you said, Dael, a lot of the powers and so forth in 4th edition were treated as having their gameplay elements and their storytelling elements with kind of a wall between them. They were still a part of the same thing, but it was like you had your bread and you had your ham and cheese next to it. If you wanted to combine them, you could, but the game didn't want to tell you that. The game thought it was most important that you knew what ingredients were in that sandwich. And for a highly complex and detailed tactical miniatures battle game, that's a great approach. You can see it being done in Lancer, my favorite highly tactical miniatures battle game on the market right now. And yet, when it comes to 5th edition, a game that wants to be narrative, but not too narrative, because we have a history of D&D combat to uphold here, they want to make sure that you are thinking about both at once. And from a writer's point of view, how do you get your audience to think of these things not as separate, but as unified? Well, you write a natural language in a way that unifies the text. You do everything you can in the writing of the thing to avoid separating your chocolate and your peanut butter. And some people find this obnoxious because they want to... Well, I don't want to tell anyone why they want to do that, because there's probably about a million reasons why. I can think of 3 off the top of my head already. So if you have a reason why you want that, I trust that your reason is a good one. I trust that it makes sense to you and it makes sense to your group, and it jibes with the way that you want to play D&D. But that is different from the way that Wizards wants to teach D&D to new players. And that is, predominantly the main function of D&D's hardcover books.
I think I like the way that 5e kind of tackles both sides of this in terms of providing the flavor text, as Dael was describing, kind of up front and then leading into the mechanical text. But if you read closely, you can usually tell where that change has happened and where it is now just kind of mechanical text, still written in a naturalized language, but this is the bones of what this ability, spell, whatever does once you get past the first sort of sentence or two. And the reason I like it this way is not only is it easy to read, but I've kind of had both spectrums of players at my table where, and it is a tension. There's a tension between these two things. And it's a tension that I'm constantly talking with people who have written 5e work that I'm editing, saying like, your language stays too naturalistic. You're not following along with the language of the rules later. So it's not clear what this ability really does or what the limitations of it are, etc., because you haven't laid those out. That tension exists because in the chat, people have been saying they just need the rules. They don't need any of the flavor text. Just give me the rules. I'll create the flavor text at the table, right? And I'm constantly saying to players, this spell doesn't need to be a singular defined thing. You could cast Fireball by breathing fire. You could cast Fireball from your eyeballs. You could cast Fireball by clicking and everything. You don't have to follow the flavor text that's written out in the book. At the same time, if that flavor text isn't there for me myself, sometimes I'm like, what is this meant to do? What are they describing here? I don't quite get what this is. I need like a starting point to be able to let my imagination kind of spin off from. And I've also had players at my table where I remember this happened at an online convention we were running specifically. So I'd never played with this person before, but they were in a combat and they cast, I think, like Flaming Sphere or Ray of Heat Ray, 3-ray Heat Monty, whatever that spell's called. Scorching
Ray.
Scorching Ray, thank you. And I'm like, oh, what does it look like when you cast this spell? Tell me the narrative of what's happening here. So you're involved in the storytelling as well. And the person kind of awkwardly goes, it says here that, and just reads from D&D Beyond, which is fine. If that person just wants to engage with the game system and doesn't personally care as much about, or isn't, as a creative of a person, which is fine, can't think on their feet as easily, that flavor text provides them access to the story without needing to like think of it off the top of their own head there and then every single time that the spell is cast. So I think largely, as I've been thinking about this the last couple of minutes as you've all been talking, I'm like, I think I like the happy medium that 5e is currently kind of sitting in terms of accessibility and yet clearness generally of what the rule actually is.
And they're trying to strike a difficult balance. Like I said, there are pros and cons. Like there is always that frustrating moment when you're at the table, they're casting a spell and you say, okay, what does that spell do exactly? Because they'll always just say the spell name. I cast such and such, right? And you say, okay, what does that do exactly? And they look down and they read the whole thing, but you have to wait through the first, 2 sentences before you actually start figuring out what the spell does. There are little, bits and bobs like that are tricky. But occurred to me. So Horrible Cabbage in chat mentioned that the structure is similar to that of journalism, right? Where you have to put the most important information up top. And it's the reverse pyramid, the most important stuff up top and then get skinnier as you go down. And that just brings us back to what Shawn is saying as well, that idea that it is the specificity that is transferable between different forms. And it's in these elements of flavor text as well that you get that poetry, you get that room that I feel like 5th edition in particular has a very small set of words that are reserved in the way of card games or miniature wargaming, for example. When you talk about unconscious, that means something very specific. So that is a word that you cannot use elsewhere in the text. And there are, we use prone instead of saying knocked over or anything like that, right? There are very specific words that are tied to conditions or other game mechanics that are like barred for use only in those circumstances. But everywhere else, you get that poetry of the specificity of language. You get to choose what you call this ability. You get to choose the words that you use in the flavor text for it. And there is room for both specificity and clarity and, also keeping some words set aside for specific mechanical definitions, which I think is how 5e kind of has a little bit more balance than I think a lot of previous editions have maybe seen.
You can see Wizards kind of trying to increase the level of clarity in some ways in the 1D&D playtest by having a lot of capitalized and underlined words.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know if I like it.
I mean, I like because that specificity that Dael, like you just use the example prone, and I swear I have definitely made this specific edit before to somebody who said, this ability, person makes saving throw. If they fail, they take this much damage and are knocked over, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, are they
Gotta say prone.
Yeah.
It's a weird word, but you gotta say prone.
Is that the effect that is affecting their character now?
They are lateral recumbent.
There we go. That's the edit we needed to make. The last part of Cassandra, well, it's not the last part, but it's the third part that I pulled out of Cassandra's email, was about nomenclature. And I think, James, you may enjoy this part of the email because I believe you and I have had this sort of discussion before, which is about naming things in a creative piece of writing that you're doing, whether it be rule text or sort of otherwise. Do you generate names, or how do you generate names, rather? Do you use real-world references? Do you enjoy using jokes in your names, or is there pressure to be witty and clever if you're trying to be?
This is a really cool one. This is a really cool question that I think affects any fantasy writer, not just a D&D writer, because names mean a lot. Names carry an enormous amount of meaning, because you think about the names of any culture on Earth or otherwise, they tend to mean something. And when you create a fantasy culture, the names you use provide a ton of implicit information about the story, right? There's a reason why these days the Forgotten Realms tend to use exclusively kind of, to put it charitably, extremely made up names, or to put it uncharitably, fantasy nonsense as their names. When you can also see, kicking around in there, Baldur's Gate, for example. The Norse god Baldur? What's he doing here? And so there will be plenty of times when, as a fantasy writer, you are inclined to use the shorthand that Earth-like mythology will bring to a story. We already know what our associations with Thor or Hades are. There's another D&D one. Hades is one of the planes. Why? That's a good question. I don't know. It has nothing to do with Grecian Hades.
I saw Elysium in there somewhere too when I was looking at that list.
Yeah. Elysium. I mean, Gehenna. That's Semitic. And there's more in there too. Hell. What are the hells doing? What's hell doing here? We've taken that word, which has a very specific, or in some ways very broad, cultural meaning, and they have layered some in-universe specificity onto the notion of hell. It's very distinct from what we might think of as a Christian hell, even though they share a variety of chiefly aesthetic similarities. So, generally, with the exception of some of those mainstays that were invented 40 years ago for D&D, their home settings tend to use things that are wholly original to avoid calling upon those little head scratchers. Those ones only kind of get a pass because they're legacy. They have a legacy within the medium. And yet, for example, when we do Grimhall of the Valakan clans here at Ghostfire, because we want to draw a parallel between Valaka and Norse mythology, we're going to use Scandinavian names. We're going to use Icelandic, actually chiefly Icelandic names were used in my part of that, at least, because they have the most sort of Old Norse feel to them. We're just invoking a feeling. We're not doing anything more than that. We're invoking a feeling. But if you're not careful in the way you invoke your feeling, people might start to make assumptions that you don't want them to make.
The question was, how do you generate names for creative projects? And my answer is poorly. I just start throwing letters together until it sounds like the thing that I want it to be. So I will use names of people I know, but switch letters around until it's unrecognizable as them, but also invokes the feeling, the guttural sounds if it's something I want to sound guttural, or the lilting sounds if it's something I want to sound lilting. And I like to. There's a goblin in an adventure I'm working on right now who is only worried about his credibility with his bosses. So his name is Kred, Khed. So the DM will not realize that I'm talking about credibility, but when he tells the players and Kred says, it sounds like a cred, it sounds like a guttural, but that is there, and maybe it will trigger something in someone's brain that, oh, this goblin is looking for credibility. That's why he's attacking us. Maybe we can somehow deal with him in a different way to increase his cred and not have to fight him and his clan. That's how bad I am.
I'm similar. Like, I think that I do kind of similar things. I mean, and as James mentioned a moment ago, I have a real, my nitpick, what's the word, Dael?
Your hobgoblin, your bête noire, your thing that pisses you off?
Thank you. Isn't so much names of something that I recognize, but names that sound very distinctly completely made up, like Tam Tam the Goblin, or like I don't know, Bloop Blop. Like if reading through and largely because a lot of these terms were completely made up, but reading through the Call of Cthulhu monster manual, I felt like I was reading through a Rick and Morty monster manual because it was just like flip floop and a drig doggle and I'm like, I can't connect to any of these, I don't know why, because the word vampire or the word lycanthrope or the word draugr all could sound equally made up, but because they have a history, because they have a heritage, they sound real, and I feel that I can get more invested in this world, in this real place, rather than this imagination land where everything's kind of made of jumping castles, And so for me, I do not a dissimilar thing to Shawn and not a dissimilar thing to what James was saying. I think it's just doing it carefully, and respectfully and appropriately, so that you're not just grabbing names and sounds and things from different cultures that aren't related to what you're trying to do. But before I was working for Ghostfire, I wrote my own adventure called Vault of the Living Flame, which was Norse inspired as well. And at one point I was like, I need a name for a creature that I want to be like a singular creature that is somebody who's become lost in the wilderness and they've frozen to death and they've resorted to cannibalism and they've kind of transformed into this, monstrous thing. And initially, my initial instinct was to find some way of getting Wendigo in there because I really love the Wendigo myth. But in this very largely Norse-inspired setting that I was working on, that didn't feel appropriate to just be porting this thing from a completely other part of the world sort of in here. And so I changed what I was going for and used something else instead. But for you naming NPCs, I'll use real world names that feel region appropriate to the character that they are, so that they don't feel like they're Blip Blorp, the human blacksmith. They feel like they are sometimes it catches my my party off guard when I think I've told the fable of Justin the pirate before. When the party were walking in, and I was like, the pirate called Justin, and it just, it snapped them out of the game completely rather than keeping them embedded in. But I think Blip Blorp probably would have had the same effect.
I was pretty highfalutin when I started this out, and I want to kind of ground what I'm talking about and give 2 pieces of advice for people who want to name names in a way that sounds good. And there's one piece of advice for if you just want good sounding names. There's another piece of advice for cohesive world building, because names can be very powerful in doing that, as you were just saying, Ben. When it comes to just good sounding names, like you said when talking about Call of Cthulhu monsters, if there's nothing in our understanding, which is, for us, chiefly rooted in the English language, but also because we live in a global community, has understanding of other cultures as well, drawing upon sounds that invoke certain thoughts can be very, very powerful, especially when you take 3 or 4 and kind of build a new word out of them, out of these building blocks and invoke different things. Now, I'm not nearly smart enough to come up with a great example off the top of my head. The thing I had in the back of my mind was, okay, I'm gonna make a lava mage, and so that's gonna be like fire and rock. What's a word that's fire? Well, let's just go with fear or fire. And what's rock like avalanche? So let's call him Firanch. And that's a terrible name. But you will create a lot of terrible names doing this until you get one that is both evocative of the things you want to do and sounds suitably fantastical and epic and good.
Here's my thing, all right? If you want to find names that feel evocative, I'm such a big believer in just naming places or people after things. Like find a word that means that thing that you're looking for. I have this setting where the whole point of it is magic is at the absolute height. It's at its zenith. So I'm like, what am I going to call this place? I ended up calling it Miracle, because the idea is that this is the man-made miracle. You know what I mean? That's my place name. And then from there, I was like, that's a bit weird that they would just call this place Miracle from the get-go before. All right, well, I ripped off the map from this city in Brazil. Let's look at some Portuguese words that have to do with water, because it's a port city, and find one that starts with M, right? And make it work from there. I'm a big believer in, I had a character who their whole thing is invention and working with furnaces and blah, blah, blah. And so I called them Ferris, this idea of working iron. I'm a big believer in, you can find a word that has, I love that we live in a world steeped in the language always has connotations. Every word has a million connotations, and there will always be a word that carries that undercurrent that you're looking for. For NPCs, I have a huge list of just names that I have gotten that I was like, this sounds like a strong person name. This sounds like a skilled person name. And so if I'm coming up with an NPC name on the fly, I'm like, well, this person's a wizard. They're smart. Let me look at my intelligence name list. You know what I mean? And just grab one from there. And usually I go to behind the name, random name generator. It's a lifesaver. I go there and I set it to the maximum number of names. And I basically include Roman, Greek, Victorian, Shakespearean, things like that, and just have it generate a ton of names. And lots of them are going to be crap, but there'll usually be one that you're like, I can work with that. You tweak it a little bit here, you tweak it a little bit there. I don't think it has to be something that you get too caught up in. Honestly, I think that, here we go, opinion time with Dael. I hate the names in the D&D official adventures. Usually, it stands out to me when I don't hate one of the names. I skip over the names and I rename all those characters because the names are illegible.
It's the Call of Cthulhu effect.
Yeah, but it's also it feels like 5e adventures, because they're, sorry to interrupt you, Dael.
No.
I'm affirming your point. They feel like jumping castle imaginary lands when you have the arch nemesis of Lost Mines of Fandelver is the spider. I'm the spider. I'm going to, and I'm just like, I don't buy it.
Which I think can work in certain contexts, but it has to really fit the vibe of what you're doing. You know what I mean? I think part of it, when you're just chucking a bunch of consonants together, there's always an X in there, there's always an apostrophe. It's that thing that Ben was talking about. It feels made up to me, and that's fine. A lot of people love that brand of fantasy where it's just a jumble of letters. for me, I prefer it to feel grounded in something. I love using anachronistic things as well, something that sounds a little bit out of place. I'm a big fan of that sort of stuff. Like when I write flavor text, I love to include things. And here we go, we're back to personal writing style. I like to include things like if I'm describing Twilight, I will say, it's just hitting that time of day when you realize the house is too dark and you need to turn the lights on, because that feels like something that people can relate to. And it tells you, oh, that's the level of light that we're talking about. It's such a very specific description that even though it doesn't fit in a fantasy setting, people know what I mean. I love using little descriptions like that. And I love giving people touchstones for what a name or a word or a description means.
Well, here's my second piece of advice when it comes to naming, and it relates to world building. Because you can create as many names as you like, but if you're not careful, just creating names is like kind of seem fantastical and aren't rooted in any particular culture, you run a real big risk of creating Forgotten Realms style fantasy word salad or consonant salad or syllable salad. You'll get names like Jarlaxle, which, while I do think is an iconic character, I don't care for that name very much. Dritz-de-Worden neither, if I'm going to be perfectly honest. However, if you want to tell a story that has a really cohesive sense of world building, one thing you can do is select every culture that is going to be of some import in your world. And you can draw that along fantasy ancestry lines, which I think is a very sort of classic D&D way of doing things, or, along civilizational lines or anything like that. And just from the beginning, choose a couple of syllables that are core to the identity of that civilization. Write them down in your notes somewhere. Because when I think of, for example, Norse names, I think of some particular sounds and spellings. I think of the J that makes a Y sound as seen in Fjord or Mjolnir. I think of, well, I'm really deep in the weeds thinking of this, but I think of archaic English letters like the thorn and the eth that simply aren't used in modern English anymore, but are descended from Norse. And so if you have some sounds like that you can use to create words that, are nonsense, but that have a sort of sense of continuity between them within a culture, you will start to create names that feel natural in the way that we think of names as being natural, because our brains are huge pattern recognizing machines. And so you can trick your players out of the blip blorp Call of Cthulhu shubba lubba dubba-doo monster effect by just repeating these things. And through the repetition, they will start to feel natural, and they will stop second guessing yourself.
My next bartender, wabba shabba lubba doo.
Just two quick things. If you do go to other languages or other cultures to get your names, remember that there's a possibility if you publish this that someone who speaks that language fluently is going to be reading this. So you are, putting Mr. Asshat into an adventure where people will understand what asshat means in their language. The second
and that
thing
is why Wizard don't do that no more.
Yes, for sure. And also, no matter how great your name is, no matter how much you languish over it, as soon as it hits the DM's book and as soon as it hits the player's ears, it will be mocked. So, Ferris, that was the greatest. I love that. Bueller, anyone?
I was ready and willing.
Anyone?
I think I made that joke before anyone else did.
Exactly. So, it's no matter what you do, you could spend forever on it. And there are going to be minds out there that are going to twist it, and that's okay. We let them have their fun, or we have our fun in those cases, and we don't worry about the repercussions.
If you want to defend against your players making fun of a name you're really attached to, stick Jonathan in the same scene. Give them a real easy target.
Well, thank you for that email, Cassandra. It did actually end up taking up pretty much the whole episode, so we didn't get around to our other emails, but perhaps next week we will get on to those. If you have an email, a question that you want us to turn over here again and again and think about and discuss and chat and give you advice on, email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. Pardon me, or you can comment in the YouTube comments down below if you're watching this on YouTube, or you can come hang out with us in person, ask questions in person for the unedited version of the Lorecast on Twitch, Mondays, 7 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 9 a.m. Tuesdays, Australian Eastern Standard Time, and the rest of you all around the world, gods be with you, because I am not going to work out that many time zones. But we had someone from UK drop in today for the first time. Welcome, that person. Glad that you're here. We will be here next week, though, with another episode of the Eldritch Lorecast. I've been Ben Byrne here with James Hake, Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin, and we will see you next week.
Ba, 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 ba.